listeners, and welcome to another installment of Just the Facts and More, the podcast in which I take the 1960s incarnation of the TV show Dragnet and I look at it in a cultural and historical context. My name is Dave Amiot, and this week I'm talking about The Hammer, Episode 7 from Season 1, written by Henry Irving. Before I get started, I want to take a moment and warn you, this is probably going to be a long one. I have a lot of thoughts about this episode. I really like it, but I'm going to go into depth at the end. And I actually don't have a whole lot of news and history and cultural stuff at the top of the show, so just be prepared for that. This episode first aired on March 2nd, 1967. Some notable people who have March 2nd as their birthday include Mikhail Gorbachev, who was born in 1931, the musician John Bon Jovi, born in 1962, and Desi Arnaz, who was born in 1917 on March 2nd. The number one song was Kind of a Drag, recorded by the Buckinghams.
Kind of a drag when your baby says goodbye.
The number one fiction bestseller on the New York Times list was The Secret of Santa Vittoria by Robert Crichton. It had had a long run on the list and would remain so. This was its 25th week on the New York Times bestseller list. Not sure how many it was at number one, but it was there for a long, long time. The number one nonfiction bestseller was Everything But Money by Sam Levinson, which I've talked about before. Also on the nonfiction bestseller list at number 9 was the book The Boston Strangler by Gerald Frank, who was from Cleveland, Ohio. This book was one of 2 by Gerald Frank that would win an Edgar Award for Best Factual Crime Book. Mr. Gerald would also write memoirs with such luminaries as Judy Garland and Zsa Zsa Gabor. So this book, The Boston Strangler, may be of interest to any true crime fans out there. At movie theaters, the number one film was Hurry Sundown, directed by Otto Preminger. This film starred Jane Fonda and Michael Caine. It also featured John Philip Law, Burgess Meredith, Robert Reed, George Kennedy, Diane Carroll, and Faye Dunaway in her first film role. This movie was based on a 1965 novel about some scheming land grabs going on in Georgia. There's also a subtle racial and class elements included. If you were going to the movies, the average ticket price in the United States was $1.22. And this was at a time when Michael Caine's movie Alfie was still in theaters, so he was having a good year. If you were in Los Angeles and you picked up a copy of the LA Times, these are some of the headlines that would greet you. First of all, we've got House votes to bar Powell from seat. This related to a national scandal surrounding Representative Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who had been investigated and accused of misusing congressional funds. Mr. Powell was an African-American man from New York. His district included Harlem. He was the first African-American representative elected to Congress from New York State. And he had risen to positions of influence on various committees, and there was speculation that that is why his activities got this sort of scrutiny. People were looking for something to embarrass him or discredit him, with grounds or not. I found it interesting. Apparently, Mr. Powell's primary response to these charges that he was misusing funds, doing personal travel on his office's account, giving jobs to relatives that they weren't qualified for or overpaid for on a government salary. His defense was that he wasn't doing anything that other Congress people weren't doing, and he would continue to do so as long as he held his office. So it wasn't I don't do that stuff or that stuff isn't wrong. It was just everybody else is doing it. Yeah, there's no reason for you to single me out. In any case, this was around an issue where there was a vote in Congress not to credential him and allow him to take his seat. It ended up getting resolved the next year because he got reelected. Also on the front page of the LA Times, Reagan to ask record amount in new taxes. Request for $865 million ascribed to failure of his 10% spending cut effort. This was involving Governor Ronald Reagan of California. He was going to need this to raise taxes, basically, because he couldn't cut the budget like he promised he would. This tax increase would be 4 times higher than any previous tax increase in the history of California. Basically, Reagan acknowledging his failure, and then 13 years later, he would be elected president. Also on the cover of the LA Times, Hoffa ordered to start 8-year prison term on Tuesday. This related to Jimmy Hoffa, head of the Teamsters Union, who had been convicted for jury tampering. This sentence would be commuted in 1971. He made a deal with the Nixon administration to get out of jail in exchange for agreeing not to be involved in any other labor organizing efforts. If you were in another part of the world, specifically Brandon, Manitoba, Canada, you could pick up a copy of The Brandon Sun, where the big banner above the title headline was "Financier Nabbed in Murder Plot." And that sounds a bit sensationalist. This relates to Clay Shaw, a Louisiana businessman who was being investigated by Assistant District Attorney Jim Garrison, who, if you're familiar with the film JFK, he's the guy who was obsessed with the truth about the Kennedy assassination. And this man, Clay Shaw, was believed to have been involved. So murder plot is a bit reductive. But yeah, that was the big headline there on the cover of the Brandon Sun in Manitoba, Canada. I will admit my Canadian geography knowledge is a bit lax. I was not sure where Manitoba is. It is in the middle of the country, basically. If you're in America, if you're in North Dakota and go north, you're probably going to be in Manitoba. It's sort of skirts North Dakota and Minnesota. If you looked a little further into the newspaper, on the comics page, in Dick Tracy, we see the criminal Half and Half preparing to dispose of his new young wife, Zelda, the high diver. Zelda had discovered that Half and Half had killed his previous wife and had evidence to prove it. So Half and Half subdued her and was getting ready to bump her off. Then also on the comics page, in Peanuts, this was another instance in which Charlie Brown lost a kite to the notorious kite-eating tree. But this strip had an interesting layout. Instead of being 3 panels or 4 panels, it is 8 narrow panels. So very eye-catching. And each panel is really just an image of Charlie Brown and him saying something, but unconventional layout. If you did not want to watch Dragnet on this evening, you had a couple of other options. The CBS evening movie was Bye Bye Birdie, the 1963 musical directed by George Sidney, starring Dick Van Dyke, Janet Leigh, Paul Lynde, and Anne Margaret.
Bye, bye, Birdie. I'm gonna miss you so.
This was the second time in about 6 months that CBS had run Bye Bye Birdie. They had aired it in October of the previous year as well. Over on ABC at 9:30, opposite Dragnet, there was an episode of That Girl. This one entitled Leaving the Nest is for the Birds. And this episode featured Jerry Van Dyke, brother of Dick, as a man who turns up on the ledge outside Anne's apartment window intending to kill himself, while Anne and her parents are hosting a dinner party for Anne's judgmental Aunt Harriet, played by Hazel Charute. Over on NBC, before Dragnet on this evening, it was the first broadcast of the Star Trek episode This Side of Paradise, which I've also heard referred to as the Elias Sandoval episode. On this one, the Enterprise crew beams down to a planet where they encounter spores that affect the brain. They cause euphoria and joy, and they even affect Mr. Spock, the emotionless Vulcan. He gets happy, and he wants to stay, and Captain Kirk has to make him angry in order to get him to leave. After this episode of Dragnet on the Dean Martin Show, Dean was joined by Vince Edwards, who had played Dr. Ben Casey. Also a couple of singers, Keely Smith and Marilyn Michaels. Marilyn Michaels was also a comedienne, and she specialized in comic songs. Also on the Dean Martin Show, Dan Rowan and Dick Martin, who are always good for a laugh. I would probably stick with NBC on this night. It's likely I would have watched Bye Bye Birdie in October. Like many people in America, I have a complicated relationship with Bye Bye Birdie because of my experience in high school musical theater. However, the movie is significantly different from the stage show in a lot of ways. So, the songs are mostly the same, but the plot and the structure and what happens pretty significantly different. So yeah, I guess I'd probably stick with Star Trek and then Dragnet and then Dean Martin. Getting into this episode, it's a big cast with a lot of familiar names and faces. Art Ballinger is back again as Captain Hugh Brown. We've got Mary Anders as Officer Dorothy Miller. This was her first of 7 appearances as this character. We had previously talked about her in the episode about the Big Clan, the one with the fortune tellers. We've also got Natalie Masters as Mrs. Ridges. She had played the busybody neighbor in The Senior Citizen, the one who comes over to scold Joe for not being welcome. And then we've got Don Stewart as Officer Carl Goldman. Don Stewart, who I'd mentioned before, was the star of the film Carnival Magic, which was used on Mystery Science Theater 3000. He played Markov the Magnificent. A couple other notable people in the cast here. Brian Avery appears as Terry Ridges. Among his notable credits, he was in the Woody Allen movie Sleeper, and he played Carl Smith in The Graduate. Carl Smith was the guy that Elaine was going to marry at the end until Benji showed up. And we've got Chet Stratton as Chesney Guthrie. This is one of 4 episodes in which he appeared. He had been in the Frauds episode about the department store. He was also in 1 episode of Adam 12 and 1 episode of the 50s version of Dragnet. We've got the young actress Jill Banner as Camille. This is one of 5 episodes that she was in. She also did in Adam 12. James Oliver appears here as Fred Tosca. He did 4 episodes of Dragnet, including the LSD story, the first episode of the 1960s version. He was also in 2 Adam 12s, and he appeared in Lethal Weapon 2, 3, and 4, but in different roles each time. So keep an eye out there for James Oliver if you're revisiting the Lethal Weapon series. Then we've got Ben Chandler as Chief Everett Snoddy. That's Snoddy. He has only 3 acting credits listed on his IMDb page. In addition to this, he was in a show in the 50s that also featured Jack Webb, and then he played a general in an episode of Wonder Woman. So, getting into this episode, it starts out a bit strange with the narration. Joe Friday's talking about how people come to Los Angeles to try and get famous. Sometimes they do, sometimes they die. When they die, he goes to work. And it's just a weird shift. Especially considering that during the course of the episode, the murder victim here, this is an episode about a murder, the victim here didn't seem to come to LA to get famous, or at least if he did, we were never told that. So, still, it's the only down spot in an episode that I otherwise like a lot. We are told that it is Wednesday, April 13th, which is accurate for 1966, which would have been the most recent April when this episode aired.
It was Wednesday, April 13th. It was warm in Los Angeles. We were working the day watch out of Homicide Division. The boss is Hugh Brown. My partner's Bill Gannon. My name's Friday.
We start out at Bill Gannon's desk, and we see that he is a Hunt and Peck typist. Then here comes Dorothy Miller. She has brought Bill his lunch, which is a hard-boiled egg. Joe shows up. They talk a little bit. Joe compliments Dorothy, mentioning that she is prettier than Petrovich or Higby, presumably two other guys that work in the department. In this first episode, where she appears, we learn that Dorothy Miller has a 9-year-old daughter, which I don't think gets mentioned again. I certainly didn't recall it thinking about her character. It would complicate things a bit if she and Joe became romantically involved. We've never gotten any indication that Joe doesn't like children. There was an odd thing that Jack Webb did when Dorothy offered him one of the cookies that her daughter had made. He doesn't take a significant bite out of it. He just kind of nibbles the edge. And I wasn't sure if that was because he wanted to keep the prop cookie intact in case they needed to do multiple takes, or maybe he didn't want his mouth full if he had to say a line, or if the cookie was just really hard and he didn't want to be loudly crunching on it. But it makes Joe Friday look as though he's tentative about trying this cookie, which is just oatmeal and honey. There shouldn't be anything objectionable about it.
I hate to eat alone.
Yeah, she is prettier than Petrovich or Higby at that.
Thanks, friend.
And I think that's probably as close as we're going to get to Joe Friday trying to flirt. And even though it's relatively harmless, in a modern day workplace, even a comment like that would get frowned upon. A, because it's demeaning to Officer Miller, in as much as it kind of implies that her value lies in her appearance. And it's also a little insulting to Petrovich and Higby. Like, I could see if maybe they overheard Friday say that, Higby walks over and says, "Hey, Joe, I'll have you know I am a sparkling conversationalist. But now you'll never know that, jerk." Something else I'll mention, I am originally from the Cleveland, Ohio area, and there was a successful department store there called Higby's that is now defunct. And I'm wondering if perhaps that might have inspired this name that the writer used. So in comes Art Ballinger as Chief Hugh Brown, and he sends Friday and Gannon out to investigate this murder. And here we get a little bit where Joe Friday's narration gets pretty detailed about what direction they went and what route they took and how long it took. It got exaggerated to a humorous degree in the 1987 Dragnet comedy movie that I talked about in the Patron exclusive episode, but they didn't exaggerate it that much. Joe's very detailed in his narration here. It's the comedy version is not far removed from the real version. So Bill and Joe show up at the scene of this murder, and there's a couple of things I noticed. First of all, there is a background performer who I'm pretty sure we've seen before because he's got very distinctive red hair and eyeglasses. I'm almost positive this is the same guy that's been in previous episodes. We've also got the actor Don Stewart here as a uniformed police officer. And at the site of this murder, this brutal killing, there's no blood anywhere. I realize this is broadcast network television in 1967. It's going to air at 9:30 p.m., but the lack of blood, it's going to become a factor in the question of how this crime gets litigated, for one thing. And frankly, it makes it all seem just a little too sanitary. Joe's talking with one of the other officers about the nature of the injuries, and he's got this to say.
Hammer, looks like the first 2 blows did it.
The last 4 changed his personality.
Which is, it's slightly morbid. One other thing I'll notice, we get an insert shot of a hammer. It's not clear if this is the hammer that was the murder weapon because, again, it's completely clean. There's no blood on it. There's also a piggy bank that was broken open that seems like it's going to be a factor, but I'm not sure that it ever was. Friday and Gannon have a little interaction with an older tenant of the building. The character's name is Lou Adams. He's played by Ralph Moody, and it's a pretty touching scene. We'll see Lou again. Then Friday and Gannon go upstairs to talk to Mrs. Ridges. And one of the things I noticed in the scene outside her apartment, all of the lights in the hallway of this apartment building are different colors. There's a red, there's a green, and there's a blue, which seems unlikely for a relatively low-rent apartment building in LA in the 60s. I have to assume it was a specific design choice, probably to enhance the experience for the owners of color television sets. But it's a unique stylistic decision to have made. It makes the scene pop a little more. Friday and Gannon go in, and they're talking to Mrs. Ridges, who is played by Natalie Masters, who had been the busybody neighbor in the senior citizen episode, as I mentioned. And she's got a bit of business that she's doing while she talks to Bill and Joe. She's filing her nails, kind of nervously. And it struck me that it's the kind of thing that by now has become a thing that people mock about the show Law and Order, where police detectives will go and they'll be talking to some person who's not necessarily a suspect, just someone who might have information, but they do it at the person's workplace or while the person is doing some other chore, so that the actor who they're talking to will have some business, something to do with their hands. Maybe they're walking around the room a little bit, putting things on shelves. It's just to keep it from being a talking heads scene. And here we've got Mrs. Ridges filing her nails. And it also informs her nervousness because she suspects that it's possible that her son Terry might be involved in this murder business somehow. There's a nice little bit of acting here from Harry Morgan, because he asks Mrs. Ridges if he and Joe can look around. But before he asks, we see him looking around. And then he asks, and they go over, and he goes right to the shirt with the stain on it, which Mrs. Ridges is convinced is chocolate that she was trying to get out. Friday and Gannon suspect that it might be blood, because blood dries brown. And they take the shirt because it could be evidence. So that's the end of Act 1. We're only about 7.5 minutes into this episode, and it's been really good so far. Character stuff with Joe and Bill and Dorothy. They show up. There's the murder. It's kind of grisly. There's the emotional scene with Lou Adams. And now we've got a suspect. Terry Ridges, Mrs. Ridges' son, might have done it because he had blood on his shirt. The show breaks for commercial, and now we come back. Terry Ridges, played by Brian Avery, has now shown up at police headquarters. He has voluntarily arrived on his own to talk to Friday and Gannon, who gave his mother their business card. And he's a little antagonistic, frankly. He's kind of a jerk. He wants to know where the murder fuzz are at. I'll also point out that this was not Don Dubbins playing this character. I thought it was at first glance. Something else that stretches credulity a little bit is that this character, Terry Ridges, we were told in the previous scene that he's 19. Here he claims to be a minor. The actor, Brian Avery, was born in 1940. So at the time this episode was made, he was around 27.
Before we talk, we want to advise you of your constitutional rights.
I'm a minor, Daddy.
Minors have rights, too.
Whether or not he can pass for 19 is a stretch, but people lived harder back then, I guess. According to my research, he is still alive, so good on you, Brian Avery. Brian's alibi for the murder is that he was with Chick, his friend. His real name is Chesney Guthrie, but he goes by Chick, and Chick has come along, presumably to back up Terry's statement. Chick's right downstairs in police headquarters, so Friday and Gannon bring him up to the questioning room, and they talk to him for a bit. And there's a funny little moment here about the distinction between a barber and a hairstylist. Chick is a hairstylist. He claims he could do remarkable things with Joe Friday's hair, but probably not Bill Gannon's. I'd be very interested to know what a hairstylist would do with Jack Webb's hair. As far as the evidence of the bloody shirt goes, we are told that it was blood, and the blood has been analyzed and has been determined to be type O. And because this is 1967, that's pretty much as far as that can go. They don't have DNA in those days. We are told that Alexander Troy, the murder victim, was a type O blood haver. But then Chick also says that he has type O blood and that the blood on Terry's shirt was his because they'd had an argument. Terry hit him with a can of hairspray and that got blood on Terry's shirt. Now, I want to mention a thing about this performance. The actor Chet Stratton as Chick Guthrie. Chick, to my mind, seems to be pretty strongly coded as homosexual. They call him a hair stylist rather than a hairdresser, which I think is an interesting choice. And he's effete, but not necessarily effeminate. Relatively speaking, for a portrayal of a homosexual person on network television in 1967, it's not bad. I mean, he's not terribly undignified. He's got an attitude and a perspective. He realizes he's in a difficult position. He's trying to exonerate his friend and himself. But he's a realistic person. He's not a caricature. And Friday and Gannon, to their credit, don't discredit his statement because of what they suspect his lifestyle is. They don't deride him. They don't make any derogatory comments about who he is or what he does or how he lives. You know, even just the choice to be a hairdresser, they don't, make any comments about that. Hairstylist, rather. So it's a bit forward thinking for 1967, I would say. Good on them. The other thing I'll point out is that part of Chick's alibi for Terry is that he was cutting Terry's hair. Terry's hair isn't especially elaborate. It's, a nice full head of blonde hair that's parted on the side, which brings up the question of the nature of Terry and Chick's relationship, but I'll come back to that later on. So Chick is the one who gives them slightly more information about the other person who had been in Alexander Troy's apartment. When they were investigating earlier, they found a scorecard from a card game with the names Alex and Fred on it. So Chick mentions that there was another guy in the apartment when Terry and Chick and Alex were talking. Terry did not mention them, but Chick brings it up. The guy, dark hair from back east, wasn't sure of his name, but he lives in the building, lives in apartment 302. So Friday and Gannon go to look at apartment 302, and the doors open, and they go in, and their guns are drawn, which is a little alarming. There's so little gunplay in Dragnet that when the guns come out, that's a notable thing. If they get fired, that's even more so. But it is troubling. It makes me wonder if they were prepared to shoot, because you wouldn't pull out your gun unless you were anticipating the possibility of having to shoot. It's just something that we as viewers are more conscious of nowadays. In any case, the occupants of apartment 302 are not there. They find a telegram in the wastebasket that gives them a little more information about who was there. And then they have this scene with the owner of the building, who tells them that part of Alex's responsibility was collecting the rents from all the tenants. The rents were all collected only in cash, which I found a bit suspicious. Makes me wonder if there was some kind of a tax dodge situation going on there. This building owner, he's wearing a remarkable, I'm not sure if it's a sweater or a jacket or what, but it seems to be inspired by the works of the painter Piet Mondrian, because it's bold black lines with brightly colored squares, and very, very 60s style there. So now we get a little bit more about this telegram that they found in room 302. The name on it is Fred Tosca. He is apparently from Boston. The telegram came from Dad, and it was sent to a hotel in San Francisco. So presumably, Fred had been staying in that hotel, got this telegram that told him to wait there, and he didn't want to wait there. And so he came down to Los Angeles. But then there's no follow-up on that. All the telegram gives them is the name, Fred Tosca. Something else I'll point out, this telegram is torn up, and there's a little scene where they're piecing it back together, but it's torn up in a way that things that get torn up don't really. It's prop torn up, And I guess it begs the question of why Fred tore it up. If he just did it out of frustration, it's too neatly done to have been done emotionally, I guess. Maybe I'm being too analytical. It just struck me as off. So after that scene, Mrs. Ridges approaches Joe Friday again and reports that her car has been stolen. It's a 1966 Plymouth Barracuda, which is a year old. It's a pretty nice car for someone living in a shabby building like this. I will point out that Sergeant Friday does not take this opportunity to explain to Mrs. Ridges that it was not chocolate on Terry's shirt, that it was blood, but at the moment, Terry is not a suspect, or at least not a significant suspect. They're following this other lead. Joe doesn't tell her that. Then we get another little scene here with Ralph Moody as Lou Adams. He wants to go in and find Alexander Troy's wedding ring because Alex wanted to be buried with it. And I really like this performance from Ralph Moody. And the character is also being very conscious that technically Alex's apartment is still a crime scene. Like, he goes to look in a drawer, but then he asks Joe and Bill, can I touch this? Is that okay? And it's real, and it shows him being thoughtful, and I liked it a lot.
Who would want to do that? Steal a poor dead man's ring? What kind of a person would do that?
The same kind who beat him to death with a claw hammer.
So the wedding ring is gone. That's another clue. And that brings us to the end of Act 2. So now Friday and basically everything they learned in Act 1 is out the window. Now they've got this other guy that they're trying to find, this Fred Tosca. They know his name and they know what car they suspect he might be driving in. So that's the end of Act 2. They come back now for Act 3. They've gotten a report from LETS, the Law Enforcement Teletype System. And they've got the background information here on Fred Tosca. He's been in and out of jail for a lot of his life. First offense at age 12. Car theft, assault with intent to kill, which I found to be an interesting distinction. According to the information we get, this Fred Tosca is 19 years old, and he's traveling with a woman, Camille Gerhardt, who is 17. And then Joe Friday gets a phone call. And there's some good phone acting here from Jack Webb, where he starts to talk, and then he realizes the other person is still talking. And during this phone call, he finds out from the building owner how much was apparently taken from the rent collection fund.
Homicide Friday. I see. Thank you very much, Mr. Denner. No, sir. No, not yet. The price of life keeps going down, doesn't it? Troy was killed for $6.58.
In modern day money, that's $50.51. And that's kind of grim. Again, we're not given any indication of what was in the piggy bank that was broken. I can't imagine that Alex Troy kept the rent payments in the piggy bank. So if there was anything in it, his own personal savings, that's gone too. But we don't have any indication of how much that might have been. At this point, the narration tells us that Joe Friday goes home. There is no shot of his apartment because upon arriving home, he gets a phone call to go back to headquarters because there's another lead. We only see a shot of Joe's end table with his phone and his lamp and what I'm assuming is a cigarette holder, maybe a tobacco case, some knickknack. I'm assuming that's a budgetary choice, but it's also a little stylish because we don't need to see Joe in his apartment. The narration tells us he got a phone call. We see a phone. They go back. So now they found out that Fred Tosca and Camille Gerhardt have been arrested and detained in Cottonwood, Arizona. So Joe and Bill and Dorothy Miller are going to go there. And Bill is an expert at traveling light. So we get a nice little scene here. Joe, Bill, and Dorothy fly to Flagstaff, Arizona, and then they have to drive to Cottonwood. They are collected by the Cottonwood Police Department's Chief Snoddy. S-N-O-D-D-Y. Chief Snoddy. First, they talk to Camille, who is uncooperative.
And I'll bet your mother had a loud bark.
And that prompted me to wonder something, because they bring Dorothy with them because the expectation is they're going to be transporting Fred and Camille back to California, and so they need to have a police woman with them to handle Camille and make sure that she's not treated inappropriately by the male officers. But, you know, we later find out that Cottonwood, Arizona, this police department only has 3 officers, and they're all men. So that does make me wonder, did they do an effective search of Camille? Did they not search Camille? That wouldn't seem to be safe or wise. I wonder if maybe the gender politics of this situation prompted a number of thoughts. I'm not sure what the satisfactory resolution of that would be. I would like to believe that these officers in Cottonwood did not mistreat Camille, seeing as how she is a woman and apparently a minor. We're told that she's 17. So, but again, you hear stories about officer misconduct. Let's hope that didn't happen. After the scene with Camille, we get a scene where Friday and Gannon are talking to Fred, and Fred is insulting them. And he's got his bit where he's not going to tell them anything except the various state capitals. He claims that they've got nothing on him. But that's not true. He was speeding, and he's in a stolen car at least. Now, he might be able to claim that he didn't actually steal the car, but at the very least, being in possession of the stolen car is a charge. Even if he was going to claim, no, somebody else stole it. This guy I know loaned it to me. I didn't know it was stolen, but did he give you the keys? Again, potential explanations are something I'm going to come back to in a little bit. Then after that, we're told it's the next morning. They interview Camille again. She's got the ring. By this time, they've also found the rent receipt in the back of the stolen car. So the rent receipt, the ring, the stolen car, that puts them all together. They're pretty sure they've got a solid case.
Now listen carefully. You and Fred went down to Mr. Troy's apartment. You hit him with a hammer. You stole his money. You tore the rent receipt out of his book so nobody would know your name. Then you stole a red automobile from in front of the apartment house.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Fred wadded up the rent receipt and threw it out of the car window, but it blew back into the luggage area. And here it is.
Something that I maybe would have liked to see is a little more of Joe and Bill and Dorothy in Cottonwood. Like, there's no indication of where they spent the night or maybe where they ate. I conceived of maybe a funny scene, like if there's one diner in the whole town and, you know, if Joe and Dorothy want to have dinner together and Bill is trying to facilitate that, but he inadvertently complicates things over and over again. You know, maybe I'll write some fan fiction. The Dragnet goes to Cottonwood. But it could have been fun. Especially when you consider that the show ends on this joke with Chief Snoddy asking how he can work out a vacation schedule when there's only 3 officers in his department. It's fine, but I would have rather have had something that was rooted in Joe and Bill and Dorothy, our regular characters. But it is what it is. Like I say, this actor, Ben Chandler, apparently needed a job. And they end the episode with him. It's cute. So, now I want to talk about the various legal ramifications of what we've seen in this episode. And there is a lot. First of all, there's the question of Camille and Fred's relationship. Because we were told that Fred is 19 and Camille is 17. Camille claims that they are married, and I am almost entirely positive that you cannot legally get married at 17 because you are not at the age of consent. In order to get married in almost every state, if you're younger than 18 and you want to get married, you have to have either a statement of permission from either one parent or both, or permission from a judge, or in some cases, both. So even if Fred and Camille, say, found a justice of the peace and lied and said that Camille was 18 and the justice of the peace married them, that would almost certainly not be a valid marriage, even though she's got a ring. And that comes into play later. There's also the question of if Fred and Camille engaged in any kind of physical sexual activity, is Fred going to face charges for that because she is a minor? It made me wonder of things I've heard about that are called Romeo and Juliet laws. The idea being if people become romantically involved when they are both under 18, or if they're within a year or two of each other in terms of age and one of them is still under 18. In those cases, criminal charges are less severe. Like in this specific instance, a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old, if it was proven that they had engaged in sexual activity, like if Camille complained or, filed a charge, that would be a misdemeanor. If Fred was more than 3 years older than her, then it becomes more and more serious. And there's also issues of consent and that kind of thing. But she doesn't seem to be complaining at all about the nature of her relationship with Fred. I get the impression she wants to protect Fred because she likes Fred. Now, that gets into the issue of, can a spouse testify against a spouse in court? And here's the subtle distinction. A spouse cannot be compelled to testify, at least in the state of California, under the doctrine of spousal privilege. That is to say, if a person is accused of some crime and the prosecution believes that the spouse has information that might support the prosecution's case, they cannot legally subpoena that spouse or issue a summons and compel them to come and testify because of spousal privilege. Now, a spouse can voluntarily testify against their spouse. So, for example, when Friday and Gannon are talking to Camille, they talk like they believe she was in the room when the murder took place. So, if she was trying to get a lesser sentence or a lesser charge than accessory to murder, she might claim, yeah, I was there. I was telling Fred not to do it. I was begging him not to do it. I couldn't stop him. She might agree to aid the prosecution in exchange for a lesser sentence for herself. But that doesn't seem likely for reasons that I'll get into here in just a bit. Because we are told that Fred was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. And that tells me that Fred Tosca had a bad attorney. First of all, first-degree murder is a very serious charge, and it implies premeditation, malice aforethought, for example. It means that Fred went there to Alex Troy's apartment intending to kill him. Murder in the second degree is slightly less serious. That would mean that Fred went to Alex's apartment to play cards, and then during the course of the evening saw the opportunity to kill Alex and rob him and acted on it. First degree murder, if you're convicted of that, you can face the death penalty. Second degree murder carries a penalty of 15 years to life, which would mean that if, say, Fred Tosca had pled guilty to second degree murder, he would be eligible for parole in 15 years. Even if he was given a life sentence, he'd still be eligible for parole in 15 years. He'd be 35. He could still do something with his life. So that begs the question of why would Fred Tosca not do that? And I'm just going to speculate here. It seems like Fred Tosca is the kind of guy who, if he had a good enough attorney, might be willing to take the chance on facing a first-degree murder charge and beating it. And I'll be perfectly honest, that does not seem like an incredible long shot, because if Camille was not in the room when Fred killed Alex, then there is no eyewitness to the murder. Yes, Fred stole Mrs. Ridge's car. Yes, he apparently robbed Alex and took the little money that was there and the ring. They found all of those things in his possession. But if I'm Fred Tosca, I could make the claim, yes, I was in Alex's apartment. I was playing cards with him. Terry and Chick saw me playing cards with him. Terry and Chick left. About 20 minutes later, Alex fell asleep in the middle of the card game. He had a good hand too, but he just nodded right off. So I left. Went upstairs, was watching TV. Camille was sleeping in the other room. After about a half an hour, I realized that I hadn't locked Alex's door. So I went back downstairs and I thought, hey, maybe there's some money around. I'd seen that ring on his end table. I thought I could rob him. And even if he suspected me, he couldn't prove anything. So I open up the door, I walk in, and there's Alex dead. So I panicked, because I know I've got a record. I've been charged with assault before. Chick and Terry saw me with him, so they would say that I was the last one with him when he was alive. So yeah, you police are probably going to try and pin this murder on me. So I grabbed whatever money I could find. I grabbed the ring. I went back upstairs. I told Camille, we got to go. Went downstairs, hot-wired this car that was parked in front, and we took off. But I didn't kill him. I'm going to say that's not an entirely implausible story. He could even say, I walked in, I saw Alex lying on the floor, I went over and I touched him to see if maybe he was still alive. That's why there was blood on my clothes. That's why there was blood in my apartment, because it was still on me when I went back upstairs. But I didn't kill him. He could even, if he was so inclined, try and shift suspicion. Because yes, Terry and Chick saw him in Alex's apartment, but he saw Terry and Chick in Alex's apartment as well. So Fred could tell some story. Yeah, me and Alex were playing cards, and these two guys, I don't know what they get up to, but they seem a little fruity, if you ask me, and I said so. And Alex laughed. He thought it was hilarious. He said to Terry, does your mother know what you get up to with that guy? Maybe she'd like to hear about it. And that made Terry mad. He was fuming. He knows better than to start anything with me, but he was just staring daggers at Alex. Who knows? Maybe he was mad about it. And of course, if you're Fred's attorney, you could try and make that claim, because this gets back into what I was talking about with the characterization of Chick. It's 1967. There are prejudices. If you're Fred's defense attorney, you might bank on the idea that if you can convince a jury that this older gay man had seduced this younger man who was ashamed about it and was embarrassed, and when Alex talked about it, the younger man then went back later that night, found the door was open, and killed him out of rage. And that's why there was blood on Terry's shirt. I don't know if that would work, but maybe that is what they had. Maybe that's what they tried, but the jury still didn't believe that alternate story and convicted Fred of first-degree murder, and that's why he was sentenced to death. Again, this is assuming that Camille wasn't with Fred at the time of the murder, assuming that Fred did it. So, if they called Camille to the stand, all she could say is, I was at home in bed. Fred came in. He had blood on him. He said, we got to go. So we left. If Fred said something like, I just killed a guy, we got to go, then Camille would presumably not want to testify to that. But again, that becomes a question of if Camille's trying to get a lower sentence. And this made me wonder, if Fred is exonerated, if he is tried for first-degree murder, and there's enough reasonable doubt that he's not convicted, then Camille really can't be charged with anything either, except maybe accessory to the car theft. We are told that she was convicted of being an accomplice, an accessory to the murder, for which she got a sentence of 1 to 5 years. But if Fred had been cleared of the murder, then you can't be an accessory to a murder that he didn't commit. So it would be in her interest to testify that he gave her no indication that he had murdered Alex. The alternative being, if she's going to cooperate with the prosecution, then she might claim Fred did come in and say, I just killed Alex, we've got to go. So I was scared. I couldn't run. I couldn't scream for help. If I tried to get away from him, he might have killed me. So, if you want to call that being an accomplice, I was an unwitting cooperator after that. I knew what he was capable of. So, maybe they convinced Camille to voluntarily testify against Fred. I don't know. There's a lot of ways this could have gone. If Dragnet was more like Law and Order, where we saw the case afterwards, that could be a pretty compelling one. Because to be perfectly honest, based solely on what we see in this episode, Fred Tosca does not have a bad case for reasonable doubt. Yes, he's guilty of the thievery, but if he says, I didn't kill Alex Troy, he was dead when I came back to the apartment, he could claim, it seems likely that Terry Ridges did it, or at least possible. It's possible that some other person from the building did it. Some random person off the street could have done it. The snag would be if there was any way to prove that it was Fred's hammer. It would have been interesting to get some kind of a lab scene, maybe with Ray Murray, where Ray's looking at this hammer and he says, Joe, this hammer's never been used on anything but a man's skull. There's no residue. There's no metal filings. There's no dents in the head from where a nail would have been. This is a brand new hammer. So, or if along with the telegram, they'd found a receipt from a hardware store that, dated 2 days previously. Then there's your premeditation, frankly. But even then, that's something else I'll point out. If Fred's intention was to kill Alex and take the rent money, doing it on the 13th of the month is bad planning. Of course, there's not going to be much rent money there. Something else I'll mention, we find out during that scene where Friday talks about rearranging his personality, the victim was struck on the head 6 times. So that kind of eliminates any claims of manslaughter. The killer, Fred or Terry or whoever, would not be able to argue, I didn't mean to kill him. I was just trying to hit him and knock him out so I could rob him. Hitting him 6 times in the skull with a hammer, you were trying to kill him. So there's that lesser sentence out the window. And, going back to if it was Fred's hammer, without, say, a receipt, that would have been a little harder to prove. They'd have to canvass every hardware store in the area with Fred's picture. Do you remember this guy? Did you sell this guy a hammer recently? And, Fred could say, yeah, Alex asked me to bring my hammer down. We were going to hang some pictures. Alex is the building manager. He had a hammer. Oh. He was going to train me to be his apprentice. I'll say this. I don't know why I've devoted so much time and energy into try to get Fred Tosca off of this murder charge. He's a jerk. But anyway, that's what I thought. And the fact that there's so much potential and so much to think about with this episode, to my mind, speaks to how good it is. I really, really like this episode of Dragnet. I would go so far as to say that it is emblematic of Dragnet from the 60s. If there was someone who had never seen any episode of Dragnet and you showed them this one, you could say, this is exactly representative. If you don't like this, then you don't like Dragnet. So you can imagine my surprise when I saw that it's not that highly rated. It's only got a rating of 7.5 out of 10. It's not in the top 30. It's down there with The Harassing Wife and IAD The Weekend, which is mind-boggling. It's so much better than those. It's got great character stuff with Bill and just the tiniest potential inkling of romance between Joe and Dorothy, but they're still all professional all the time. It's terrific. I love this episode. Anyway, next week, hopefully, I'll have a complete episode for you. We're going back to Season 4 again. Season 4, Episode 2, Homicide, the Student, from September 25th, 1969. So we're hitting a couple of themes here. Had a couple of drug-themed episodes back-to-back, and now we've got 2 murders back-to-back. So I hope you'll join me again next week for that installment of Just the Facts and More.